Okay, chapter 11, we're going to begin with the post-test, or the pre-test actually, and it really does have, most of the information here is reflective of the three levels that's actually within the chapter. So that's why I always like to go over the pre-test to kind of introduce the chapter. First one, LinkedIn got a head start in the professional networking world. And then it shows a semicolon, however, comma, new sites such as Viadio and Zing are working hard to catch up in this competitive market. So why did they place a semicolon before this word and a comma after it? Is because it's a conjunctive adverb, or another word for a conjunctive adverb is transitional expression that joins two independent clauses. So this is nothing new. We've learned this before, that a conjunctive adverb or a coordinating junction that joins two independent clauses are punctuated differently. If it's just a coordinating conjunction, and, but, or, nor, for, so, yet, we use a comma to divide the two independent clauses joined by that coordinating conjunction, and, but, or, nor, for, so, and yet. And then if it's a conjunctive adverb, then we place a semicolon before the conjunctive adverb and a comma after the conjunctive adverb. Now there's one other thing that this chapter is going to talk about. If it's a one-syllable conjunctive adverb, the comma is no longer necessary. If it's a one-syllable, what's a one-syllable conjunctive adverb? The word thus, the word hence. Those are the two most common ones. And so that comma is not necessary after a one-syllable conjunctive adverb. Okay, so number 2. New Coke was one of the most famous product failures in history. And I believe that looks like that's a colon. Yes, it is. Okay. It's a colon. And then the Sony Betamax and McDonald's Arch Deluxe were two other well-known disappointments. Okay, so reading this from scratch again, because we need to read it for comprehension of the message and why they used a colon to separate those two parts. Okay, New Coke was one of the most famous product failures in history. Then they say the Sony Betam whatever and the McDonald's Arch Deluxe were two other well-known disappointments. Actually, I think that's probably a semicolon that's in that particular location, because what the semicolon is doing there is joining two independent clauses not joined by a coordinating conjunction, and also not joined by a conjunctive adverb. So it says but. If they put the word but there, then you use a comma. But the Sony and whatever were two other well-known disappointments. If we put the word consequently, we put a semicolon before it and a comma after it, and then continue to join two independent clauses. But since we have two independent clauses not joined by a coordinating conjunction, nor is it joined by a conjunctive adverb, it's nothing more than just a semicolon. Okay, then the next one, number 3, we are not sure, however, they use commas on both sides of that word, that any business failure can match the Ford Edsel. The word however is not a conjunctive adverb. It's just parenthetically inserted. In fact, it's a parenthetical adverb that's not joining two independent clauses. In fact, it has an independent clause to begin, and then we have a dependent clause at the end of it. So it's not joining two independent clauses. As a result, it's parenthetically inserted, so we offset the word however with commas on both sides. We could leave the word however out since it's parenthetical. We can say we are not sure that any business failure can match the Ford Edsel. So it's parenthetically inserted. Anytime something's parenthetically inserted and is really not essential to the main construction of the sentence, always put commas around that. We did that with adjective clauses in the previous chapter. The adjective clause, when we said a person's name and then started with the words who or which, we would put commas around them because that adjective clause really wasn't necessary, not essential to describe that person. It just provided some supplemental information about that individual. So we offset it with commas. But we said the entrepreneur who started XYZ company is visiting the college campus on Monday. Well, which entrepreneur? Therefore, that clause that follows, who started this new company, is required. It's essential, so we don't use commas if it's essential. If it's not essential, then we do use commas. This next one, number 4, 3 of the world's most innovative companies are Salesforce.com, comma, Alexion Pharmaceuticals, comma, and Netflix. So these are nothing more than commas joining items in a series, including the last and. In the past, that last and omitted the comma, but grammarians have concluded, most of them have concluded, that it's better to go ahead and position a comma right there before the last and so that you don't interpret that as one or the other inadvertently. So that comma is required. Then number 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Microsoft earns most of its revenue from commercial licensing, comma, consumer licensing, comma, and consumer hardware. So now we have 3 items also in a series, and it's parallel with each other, licensing and hardware, so it tries to keep it consistent and parallel. So a comma separates those 3 items in a series. Then number 6, the following. Anytime whenever you say the following or the upcoming or anything to introduce a list, in that case, if it doesn't have any type of intervening elements in the middle of that sentence, use a colon to offset it. Let's see what, anytime it says the following experts or as follows or these individuals, and then you have a list, whether it's in horizontal format, in sentence form, or in a vertical format, or even the word thus to introduce the list, use a colon at the end of the clause. So the following experts were invited to speak, colon. Who are they? Janet Black, comma, College of San Mateo, semicolon. Okay, that semicolon is necessary there so that we don't confuse Larry with San Mateo. In fact, Janet is the one that's associated with the College of San Mateo. So we're going to separate her name from her location of San Mateo, comma, semicolon. Then the second person in the series, Landy Hertzberg, comma, and he's with Consumes, or however you say that, River College, semicolon, and Bob Duxbury, comma, Santa Rosa Junior College, and that ends the sentence, so we don't need a semicolon there. We just need a period to end it. And that's one thing to keep in mind about the periods and the commas and the semicolons. Period is an abrupt stop. That's the end of a sentence. An exclamation point is an abrupt stop, and that's the end of a sentence. The comma is a pause, and if you have too many commas, you may misconstrue what the true meaning of the sentence is because you're being forced to pause that location. But if I need a stronger pause, I'm going to use a semicolon. And colons introduce lists. So recognize the differences of those punctuation marks, and I think that will be helpful. Okay, so now we'll move on to the next one, which is number 7. And remember, in the last chapter, the very last thing that it mentioned is to use a comma before a short. Keep in mind, use a comma before a short quotation. Quotations are 99% of the times identified with quote marks at the beginning, at the end. And I say 99% of the time because if it's a really long quote, it's indented on both sides 1/2 inch and the quotation marks are removed. if it's a really long quote. So the last chapter ended with a short quote. What is a short quote? It's probably up to a maximum of 2 sentences, 1.5 to 2 sentences. That's a short quotation. If that be the case, if it's a short quotation, then it would make Gilbert Amelio said, comma, and then quote and end quote for that short quotation. That's not this situation. This is several lines. It's more than 2 sentences. This is considered to be a long quotation. So instead of using the comma after the word said, they use a colon. After a colon that introduces a quotation or a colon that's used within a sentence, most of the times you will space twice with your space bar. So now, Gilbert Amelio said, colon, and then, quote, developing excellent communication skills is absolutely essential to effective leadership, period. The leader must be able to share knowledge and ideas to transmit a sense of urgency and enthusiasm to others, period. If a leader can't get a message across clearly and motivate others to act on it, comma, then having a message doesn't even matter, period, end quote. Long quotations, so a colon introduces long quotations, more than 2 sentences. A comma would introduce a short quotation. Then number 8. John Moe has one major career goal, colon, space, space. He wants to become CEO of a large corporation. Use a colon after an introductory independent clause. Joe Moe has. That's an independent clause there. And then the next clause basically supplements the first clause, illustrates the first clause, or answers the question of the first clause. So right here, use a colon if second clause explains or supplements the first clause. Joe Moe has one major career goal, and then you can ask, well, what is it? He wants to become CEO of a large corporation. Since it's answering the question of the first clause or the statement of the first clause, use a colon to separate it. Yes, sir.
Why wouldn't you just use a period if I like if I was writing an essay, I'd be like, John Moe has one major career goal in mind, period. He wants to become a CEO of a large corporation. Would that be acceptable, or is it just they're just doing it just to show how you're able to use it?
To answer your specific question, and just to share this on the podcast as well, the question that was presented is, why not just use a period to separate these 2 clauses? That works, okay, by the way.
It does work, right?
But it makes it choppy. Look how choppy this sentence is with a period. John Moe has one career goal, period. He wants to become CEO of a large corporation, period. It's almost like you're separating the thought. So that colon basically provides the illustration or the explanation to answer that statement of the first clause. That's why the colon works better than the period. Is it wrong to use a period? No. It's better to use a colon because it keeps it in context with what it's really wanting to convey to the audience. Good question. Number 9, although the committee had many cities from which to choose, comma, it decided to focus on resorts, namely, locations, namely, has a semicolon before, namely, and a comma after it, Las Vegas, comma, Scottsdale, comma, and Honolulu. Excuse me. Okay, several things to consider on this one. First of all, we have a conditional word, although, since, because, if, had, many other subordinated conjunctions, and a noun and verb follow. So committee had, right after your conditional word. That usually sets up what is called a dependent clause because it will not stand alone by itself. It needs something else to complete its meaning. It forces a natural pause, so all introductory dependent clauses must be offset with a comma. Technically, this is an introductory adverbial clause. All introductory adverbial clauses must be set off with a comma. And that's exactly what they did here. Although the committee had many cities from which to choose, and then the result, comma, it decided to focus on resort locations, semicolon, namely, comma, Las Vegas, comma, Scottsdale, comma, and Honolulu. Okay, let's look at this last part now that we've concluded that all introductory dependent clauses must be offset with a comma. The second part, if you have items that begin with the words namely, and I put this information right down here, namely, these items, for instance, these, and then these items, and that is these items. Notice how I did that, semicolon before each one of those words, and then you have items that follow. But mainly, namely, for instance, and that is. Okay, where'd my question come from? Oh, there it is, right there, namely. And then you have items that follow. So if those three words introduce a list of items, then place a semicolon after or before, namely, and a comma after it, and then these commas are inserted to separate the three items in a series. We'll look more specifically at this because there's more details related to, well, what if you have internal semicolons or internal commas to begin with? Then would you use more semicolons or fewer semicolons? And that is an issue. So we will look at that a little bit more specifically. And then the meeting will begin promptly at 2:30 p.m. No spaces with this particular colon when it's related to ratios or with time formats. No spaces, just 2:30 space, P period, M period. No spaces between the P period and the M period either. So I believe this pretest really does set up the chapter. And I've explained most of what the chapter really contains, but now let's look at the specific items within the chapter. Okay, independent clauses separated by conjunctive adverbs. Yes, we've already covered that one. Here's consequently, it has a semicolon before it and a comma after it because it joins two independent clauses. Kevin Powell wanted and he joined. That's two independent clauses joined by conjunctive adverb. So a semicolon comes before and a comma comes afterwards. Therefore is joining two independent clauses, semicolon before and a comma afterwards. Now, it does go on to say, generally, no comma is used after one syllable conjunctive adverbs, such as hence and thus and then, unless a strong pause is desired. So right here we have two independent clauses. Toastmasters International was founded, and it has. So that's two independent clauses right there, joined by a conjunctive adverb. It's one syllable, so it includes a semicolon and no comma, because it is one syllable. Okay? Then here is what appears to be a conjunctive adverb, and it is an adverb, but it's a parenthetical adverb. Anytime that you insert something parenthetically to add a little bit of a suggestion to it, or sometimes to make it more wordy, use commas to offset them, especially if they do not join two independent clauses. So we have a clause at the beginning and then a dependent clause at the end. That's not two independent clauses, so that's why commas are used to offset the independent from the dependent clause for parenthetical expressions. Okay, this next section is independent clauses without coordinating conjunctions or conjunctive adverbs. Okay, coordinating conjunctions are and, but, or, nor, for, so, and yet. And then conjunctive adverbs are the words like consequently and therefore and however, and whenever they join two independent clauses. But if you're missing a conjunctive adverb or a coordinating conjunction, just use a semicolon to separate two independent clauses. It's a compound sentence in all three of those situations. Compound sentence uses a comma to join two independent clauses whenever there's a conjunction after that comma, and, but, or, nor, for, so, and yet. That's one way to make a compound sentence. The second way to make a compound sentence, or to create one, is to place a conjunctive adverb to separate those two independent clauses with a semicolon before it and a comma after it, unless it's a one-syllable conjunctive adverb, and then it just requires a semicolon. And then the third one is whenever a conjunctive adverb and a coordinate conjunction do not exist. So just place a semicolon. That's how you form compound sentences. Okay, this next section, series containing internal commas or complete thoughts. Okay, the three U.S. cities with the largest populations are New York, New York, Los Angeles, California, and Chicago, Illinois. So in this particular case, we have internal commas to separate the city from the state. So New York, comma, New York. Now, to separate that part from the next part, because of these internal commas, use a semicolon to separate these items in a series. So there's a semicolon there, and the next one is Los Angeles, comma, California, then a semicolon there, and then the last item in the series is Chicago, comma, Illinois. That ends a sentence, so it's just a period. So if you have internal commas to separate items in a series, but there are multiple ones, and you don't want to keep using commas all the way across because it will misconstrue the message that's indicated here, use a comma to divide each of those categories to join those three items in a series, or more if necessary. Okay, the next page. Semicolons are also used to separate three or more independent clauses that appear in a series and contain internal commas. This is a really large sentence. The first step consists of surveying all available information related to the company objective so that an understanding of all problems can be reached. So that's the first item. That's the first step. Now the second step, semicolon first. The second step involves internal consumers, comma, wholesalers, comma, and retailers. So there's internal commas in between the items in a series, so that's why we also used a semicolon to separate those items in a series. So there's internal commas, and then last semicolon, and the third step consists of developing a research design in which the actual methods and procedures to be used are indicated. That semicolon helps keep those items in a series flowing smoothly. Well, in the past, we've always talked about two independent clauses joined by a coordinating conjunction use a comma, unless it has 13 or fewer words, and then you don't. That's kind of the caveat right there. I'm sorry, that's in the next section. I got ahead of myself. I didn't read the statement right here. Short independent clauses in a series, however, may be separated by commas. So we have Facebook was founded in 2004, comma. It opened to the public in 2006, comma, and it started selling its stock in 2012. Those are three independent clauses, and you may be asking that same question again. Can I use a period to separate those? Yes, but they use commas because they wanted it to flow into one sentence. So it is three independent clauses this time, just to make it flow a little bit more smoothly and make one sentence out of it. They use the commas to offset it instead. So there's right answers and wrong answers depending on how you want to convey your message. Okay, now level 2. The colon is the most often used to introduce lists, long quotations, remember a comma introduces a short quotation, and explanatory sentences. Okay, use a colon after an independent clause that introduces one item. Now, I want you to pay really close attention to what that says right there because I think it gets overlooked. Use a colon after an independent clause. So you have a subject and verb, and then it introduces one item. use a colon. 2 items, use a colon, or a list of items, use a colon. So use a colon after an independent clause that introduces 1 item, 2 items, or a list of items, but make sure it follows an independent clause. A list following an independent clause may be shown horizontally in sentence form or vertically in list form, and is usually introduced by such words as the following, as follows, these, or thus. A colon is also used when words like these are implied but not stated. So here we have an independent clause here. Leaders possess. The best leaders possess 1 important trait. Here's 1 item, colon, integrity. Okay, here's 2 items on the next one. Effective leaders also possess 2 other important traits. So an independent clause is introductory. That's so important for you to recognize an independent clause comes first before the items. Colon, optimism and confidence. And then text messages are now used to deliver the following types. Following is one of the key words of information. What are they? Medical, comma, financial, comma, educational, comma, and political. So you have a list of statements of items that follow this independent clause. Therefore, you introduce that list with a colon. Several of the world's tallest buildings are located in Dubai. Several of the following is really what that's saying. So the word following isn't there, but it's implied. So what are they? And then they have internal items separated by commas. Burj Khalifa, comma, Princess Tower, comma, 23 Marina, comma, and elite residence, period. Now if you, as far as the capitalization, if you have a vertical list, by the way, I will say this, that if you had an item right here and it's not a proper noun, it's not capitalized. But if it is a proper noun, obviously Burj Khalifa is a proper noun, you do capitalize it. But whenever you have your list, you always capitalize the first word and try to make sure that they're parallel with each other. Collecting, transferring, distributing. So what they're doing is keeping that parallel and making it easier for the reader to follow that list. So these are some of the financial, these, and then you have your list, are some of the financial services the Federal Reserve provides to member banks, colon. What are they? Capitalized collecting checks, payments, and other credit instruments, transferring funds electronically, distributing and receiving cash and coins, and so it gives an, and it also doesn't end with periods, but you can if you want to. Just keep it consistent whichever direction you go with it. Do not use a colon in a sentence unless the list is introduced by an independent clause. Did I not really focus on that earlier? Has to have that introductory independent clause before the list when using a colon. But now it's saying if there is not an introductory independent clause, do not use that colon. Lists often function, this is why. Lists often function as sentence complements or objects. And we're going to have a really good reason, a way to remember when not to use a colon. When this is the case and the statement introducing the list is incomplete, no colon should follow, should be used. It might be easiest to remember that lists introduced by verbs and prepositions do not have colons because the introductory list is incomplete. Now I want to show you some examples of that and why that makes sense. Okay, let me get a marker. Countries is your subject with the highest literacy rates is a prepositional phrase. In the world is another prepositional phrase. and the verb is are. Okay, remember, if you have linking verbs, or if you have linking verbs that follow the subject, countries are, the answer to the question what or who means it's a subject complement. That's why you do not want to put a colon after a subject, after a linking verb or a regular verb, because the answer to that question, what or who, is either going to be a subject complement or a direct object. If I used a regular action verb right there, then the answer to that question is still a direct object, and that colon would break up the subject from its subject complement, and we definitely don't want to do that. So if we have an introductory independent clause that's not introducing the series with a verb or a preposition, then we'll use a colon. But if that introductory clause or lack of a clause is introduced with a verb or a preposition, get rid of that colon 100% of the time. So the subject complement that follows is Andorra, Azerbaijan, Cuba, Estonia, and Latvia. Those are playing the role of subject complements that complement the subject countries. Let's see. 3 requirements for the radiation therapist positions are an associate's degree, interpersonal skills, and 2 years experience using radiation equipment. Again, requirements is your subject. For the radiation therapist position is your prepositional phrase. Are is your verb. So these are subject complements referring to the requirements. You have to have an associate's degree, interpersonal skills, and 2 years experience using radiation equipment. So don't use a colon if a preposition or a verb, even if it's an action verb, introduces a direct object or the subject complement or the prepositional phrase. Here is a prepositional phrase example. Awards is your subject, of merit is your prepositional phrase, were presented is your verb, to, and then all of these are your prepositional phrase. The professors are the objects of the preposition to. To who? Professor Layham, Mr. Langlois, and Dr. Pieroni. So that do not use a colon whenever a verb and preposition introduces your list. Okay, next part. Use a comma after the word said when introducing a short quotation. If it's a long quotation, then don't use a comma, but use a colon instead. And then furthermore, one more thing is do not use a colon when there's an intervening sentence that falls between the introductory statement and the list. According to a recent survey, comma, these are the best companies to work for. Remember, the word these usually introduces a list, right? But now another sentence follows. Since there's the intervening sentence introduces a list, comes in between, then there's no colon to introduce a list. It's just a period. Because there's an intervening sentence that breaks up the continuity of the colon. So get rid of the colon there as well. Long quotations. Remember I said if it's a short quotation and we use a comma. But if it's a long quotation, use a colon. A long quotation is considered 2 or more sentences. Here's a long one-sentence quotation. It takes up 2 or more lines. Oprah Winfrey said, now if this is short, we use a comma, but it's considered long. Do the one thing you cannot do, period. Fail at it, period. Try again, period. Do better the second time, period. The only people who never tumble and those who never mount the high wire, this is your moment, period, own it, period, end quote. Multiple sentences, so don't use a comma, use a colon for long. Here letters long one sentence. It's more than 2 lines. Only use a comma after the word said if, indeed, it is a short quotation. Okay, explanatory sentences. Use a colon to separate 2 independent clauses if the second clause explains, complements, illustrates, or supplements the first. That's one that you were talking about earlier. So the company's new directors faced a perplexing dilemma. What was that dilemma? Colon. They had to choose between declaring bankruptcy and investing more funds to recoup previous losses. The second clause explains what that perplexing dilemma is. So that colon helps supplement it. To succeed in his job, comma, you must remember one thing. What is that? See, notice whenever I say, what is that? Each time I'm introducing that clause with a colon. You are here to serve the customer. It identifies what that one thing is. And they place that comma there to offset the introductory verbal phrase. And the modifier is you. Who is the one that's going to succeed? You are. That takes you back to the verbals chapter. Okay, finally, level 3, and we'll talk a little bit about the semicolon and the use of the word namely, and that is. When introductory expressions such as for example, for instance, that is, and namely, immediately follow independent clauses, they may be preceded by either commas or semicolons. Generally, if the words following the introductory expression form a series or an independent clause, use a semicolon before the introductory expression and a comma after it. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about that. It says, if the words following the introductory expression form a series. What is a series? 3 or more. That's what a series is. It's not 1 item, it's not 2 items, it's 3 or more. So if the words following the introductory expression form a series or an independent clause, use a semicolon before that introductory expression and a comma after it, as they did here. Google offers unique cost-free benefits to its employees, semicolon, for instance, comma. And then you have your list, and it better be a series or an independent clause. Unlimited gourmet foods and snacks, rides to and from work, on-site massage therapy, paid maternity and paternity leave, and ample time to pursue outside passions. It's a series, 3 or more. And the other reason is that if it's an independent clause that follows it, then it's a conjunctive adverb that's joining 2 independent clauses. So it meets that condition, and then it meets this condition if it introduces a series of 3 or more. Several books give tips for making wise investment decisions. For example, and then Jim Cramer's Get Rich Carefully is an excellent resource. So it's used to join 2 independent clauses. Semicolon before it and a comma after it. Now, we're going to look at it a little bit differently. If the list or explanation that follows the introductory expression is not a series or an independent clause, use commas before and after that introductory expression. So look at this one, for example, right here. We're proposing 2 new additions to the healthcare packages, comma, for example, comma, 2 items, holistic medicine and chiropractic benefits, period. 2, not 3, but 2. Since it's 2, use commas. And it's also not an independent clause. We value one trait in our employees above all others, comma, and remember this means, for example. And what are they? Integrity. Or what is it? Integrity. It's 1 item, not 3, and it's not an independent clause, so put a comma before it after it. If we did have an independent clause right here, and we have the for example abbreviation, we would put a semicolon before it and a comma after it. But it's only 1 item and not an independent clause. These same introductory expressions may introduce parenthetical words within sentences. Commas usually punctuate individual items introduced parenthetically within sentences. If the introductory expression introduces several items punctuated by internal commas, then use dashes or parentheses. And the next chapter focuses specifically on when to use a dash and when to use parentheses. And I will tell you that you will use a dash if you want to emphasize something, and use a parenthesis if you want to de-emphasize something. So that's kind of heads up on what we'll do in chapter 12. So the biggest health problem facing employees, namely workplace stress, costs U.S. employers about $300 million annually. So the commas are used because the introductory expression, namely, introduces a single item, not a series or a independent clause. Basic, look what happens here. Basic employee rights, dash. For instance, comma, minimum wage, comma, overtime, comma, and child labor protection, dash, were first mandated in 1938 with the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act. What happens here is we want to emphasize what those rights are. Okay, notice that the dash is introduced not by an independent clause. Just basic employment rights. There's no verb there. What are they? For instance, and then these items are separated by a comma, and because this list was not introduced with an independent clause, that dash works perfectly. And then that dash ends that list perfectly as well. And then rights were mandated. There's your subject and verb. Rights were mandated with the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act. So dashes are used because the introductory expression, for instance, introduces several items punctuated with internal commas, and it's not introduced with an independent clause. So I summarized it right here. The word namely, that is, if it uses a semicolon before it and a comma after it, if the word namely is introduced with an independent clause, and a series follows, and another independent clause follows, one of those two choices. Use namely with only commas if you're introducing with an independent clause, and then only one or two items appear over here. So hopefully that will help summarize that more than anything else. Now, it simplifies from this point on. Special use of the colons in business letter salutations. Using mixed punctuation, place a colon after it. If the letter is personal to a friend, then a comma is acceptable instead of the colon. Website addresses has colons to separate the protocol, the hypertext protocol, and then the actual web address with no spaces. In time, with colon, with no spaces. Just keep it consistent with whatever format that you use. Ratios, colon, with no spaces. Devoted 2-to-1 with no spaces. Publication titles. This is one that I forget about. If you have the title of a book or a periodical or something along with a subtitle, then you use a colon to separate the title from the subtitle. And 2 spaces follows. Here it is, A Random Walk Down Wall Street. That's the main title of this book. And then what is the subtitle? The Time-Tested Strategy for Successful Investing. Here we have the main title, Wall Street to Lawmakers, colon, space. Here's how to fix the deficits, an article title. Okay, capitalization following the colons. When a colon is used to introduce a series in sentence format, do not capitalize the first word after the colon unless it is a proper noun, as illustrated here. We have an introductory independent clause, and then items, colon, clarity, just use 2 spaces, but they're not capitalized. Clarity, courtesy, conciseness, completeness, correctness, and competence. But right here, it's apple, which you would not lowercase apple, you would capitalize it because it's a proper noun. When a colon is used to introduce a series in a vertical list, always capitalize the first character of that vertical list. Okay, do not capitalize the first letter of an independent clause following a colon if that clause explains or supplements the first one. Remember what we're talking about. What is that? Whenever I can ask them, well, what is this you're referring to? So Special Olympics has one overriding mission. What is that? Through the power of sport, Special Olympics strives to create a better world by fostering the acceptance and inclusion of all people. So that answers the statement. What is this that you're referring to? It illustrates that's not capitalized, that first character. Safe drivers have a specific feature to anticipate, and that would be what? Most cars will have, notice that's even a clause, but it's not capitalized because it's answering the, or referring to the first clause as providing an answer to it. But you do capitalize the first letter of an independent clause following a colon if that clause states a formal rule or a principle as a complete sentence. Ancient Greece's golden rule, we know it's going to be a rule now, should be followed today. What is that rule? In that particular case, it is a rule or a principle. What do you want to, what you do not want to happen to you, do not do it to yourself. I don't think I read that right. What you do not want to happen to you, do not do it yourself either. There we go. That was hard to read. That's a rule. Since it's a rule, then it's capitalized. Capitalize the first letter of a quotation that follows a colon. So this is considered to be a long quotation. That's why they used a colon there. And to introduce this long quotation, and it's an independent clause, make sure it's capitalized. Okay, the next step is the FAQs. Some of these are fun. This first one's the difference. When do you use the word hearty, H-E-A-R-T-Y, or hardy? What's the difference between those two words? They're commonly misconstrued for each other. The narrator was likely saying hardy whenever they said, I recently watched a documentary about the early settlers in New England and the hardships they endured. The narrator repeatedly used an adjective to describe them. However, I'm not sure whether he was saying hearty or hardy. Do you know? He was likely saying hardy, H-A-R-D-Y, which is an adjective meaning strong, bold, or capable of surviving difficult conditions. Only the hardiest passengers survived the long journey. Strong, bold, or capable. The adjective hearty, H-E-A-R-T-Y, means done or expressed in an open, cheerful, or energetic way. Therefore, the CEO gave the candidate for governor a hearty, H-E-A-R-T-Y, endorsement. Hearty can also mean strong, healthy, or active. She has a hearty, H-E-A-R-T-Y, appetite, or large enough to satisfy hunger. They ate a hearty, H-E-A-R-T-Y, meal before the marathon. Next one, my partner and I are preparing an announcement describing our new online business. We don't agree on how to punctuate this sentence. We offer a wide variety of network services, semicolon, such as design, comma, support, comma, troubleshooting, comma, and consulting, comma, etc. Two things. Don't use a semicolon or any punctuation before the word such as. Allow the list to speak for itself, and also never use etc for etc. If you believe that there's an etc that follows, then make that list, go ahead and complete it rather than letting them fill in the blanks. If you feel the need to say and so forth, use those words instead, but never use etc. So it'd be comma, consulting, comma, and so forth. Okay, a friend of mine gets upset when I say something like, I was so surprised by her remark. Well, you should, because that word so is a word that is it's an intensifier. It's an intensifying word, and so you're waiting for the result of what the word so means. He was so funny. So funny that what? He was so funny that he became a stand-up comedian. So whenever you use the word so as an intensifier, always provide a that. He was so funny that he became a stand-up comedian. So that word, that intensifier, requires an answer to why you made that statement in the first place. If you really just wanted to make a comment about a person being funny, don't use the word so. Just say, he is funny. He was funny. What's the difference between advice and advise? Advice is instruction that you get from someone else, and it's a noun. Would you give me your advice? A-D-V-I-C-E. But would you advise me? Would you give me counsel as a verb? A-D-V-I-S-E. Which word should I use in this sentence? Our department will disburse, D-I-S-B-U-R-S-E, or disperse, D-I-S-P-E-R-S-E, the funds shortly. So the word disperse, B-U-R-S-E, means to scatter. Disperse the lottery tickets from an airplane so that people could collect them. Or did you disperse to pay out? Our department will disperse, P-E-R-S-E, the funds shortly. Then finally, the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I can never keep the words capital T-A-L and T-O-L straight. Which one would be correct? He invested $150,000 of his own capital in the new business. It would be T-A-L. T-O-L refers only to a building. If I said Oklahoma City is home of the state capitol, it would be T-A-L. Only use T-O-L to refer to a building. We're going to the state capitol building, T-O-L, in Oklahoma City. Only T-O-L for the building, T-A-L all other times. It gives a little bit more of a description of it right there. The other day I said, do you think he meant to infer that employees might be laid off? A coworker corrected me. What's wrong with what I said? Number one, listeners infer, speakers imply. So if you're saying, what did you just say? Did you infer this? No, that would not be correct. So, did you imply that I need to get my spelling test completed? That would be correct. That was a little jab. But a listener, I inferred from the message this, or this. Speakers imply, listeners infer. I work in an office where we frequently send letters and email messages addressed to people on a first name basis. Should I use a comma or a colon after a citation such as Dear Antonio? If you're sending this as a business letter, use a colon. Or don't use anything if it's open punctuation. But if it's a personal letter, then use a comma. Should I space once or twice after a colon? Depends. If it's a date, if it's time, 3:30 p.m., or if it's a ratio, there's no spaces that follow a colon. But if it's in a sentence where you have an independent clause that suggests something that illustrates or renames or answers a question or refers to that first clause, then after the colon, use 2 spaces. I've just signed a contract to rent an apartment. Am I the leasee or the leaseor? You are the leasee and your landlord is the leaseor. You are the rentee and your landlord is the rentor. You are the advisee and the person advising you is the advisor. Okay, so those are some FAQs to kind of help with better constructions in business English and in business communication. We focused in Chapter 10 the use of commas, and we introduced the comma before the short quotation after the word said, or even if it's internal in a short quotation, to offset it with commas. And then we moved to colons in Chapter 11. Chapter 12 is going to go one step further, and it's going to focus on dashes and parentheses and how to use those correctly in a sentence. So we'll continue with this on Tuesday.